Well, it's really wonderful for me to be here today, and I thank you all for coming, and Sylvia in particular for her very, very kind introduction. She is more kind than objectivity perhaps would have demanded, but I wouldn't protest about that. So thank you very much, Sylvia. I'm very grateful to McNally Jackson for arranging the event along with my publisher, Harvard University Press. The idea of justice has been explored across the world over thousands of years. There's nothing exclusively, quote-unquote, Western in the importance that people have attached to justice and injustice in the world. Nevertheless, there can be little doubt that the discipline of reasoning about political philosophy in general, and about justice in particular, received an especially strong boost during the European Enlightenment in the 18th and 19th centuries, encouraged by the political climate of change and also by the social and economic transformation taking place then in Europe and America, of which the French Revolution and the American Revolution were perhaps preeminent examples. The leaders of thought in the Enlightenment did not, however, speak in one voice. There is a substantial dichotomy which has not received sufficient attention between two different lines of reasoning about justice that can be seen among two groups of leading philosophers associated with the radical thought of the European Enlightenment. One approach concentrated on identifying perfectly just social arrangements and took the characterization of quote-unquote just institutions to be the principal and often the only identified task of a theory of justice. This way of seeing justice is woven in different ways around the idea of a hypothetical quote-unquote social contract. A contract which is hypothesized that the population of a sovereign state would be a party to, and in a kind of imagined story meant to have been a party to, but that's a metaphor. Major contributions were made in this line of thinking by Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, and later by John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Immanuel Kant, among others. The principal theories of justice in contemporary political philosophy, including preeminently John Rawls's theory, what he calls justice as fairness, draw in one way or another on the social contract approach and concentrate on the search for ideal social institutions. This approach to the pursuit of justice has three distinct features, and since I'm critical of that approach, I should try to outline them as clearly as I can before I discuss why I have disagreement. First, it concentrates its attention on what could be accepted as perfect justice, rather than on relative comparisons of justice and injustice, and on the ways and means of removing recognized cases of big injustice in the world. Second, in search for perfection, this approach concentrates primarily on getting the institutions and arrangements right, and it's not directly focused on the actual societies that would ultimately emerge. The nature of the society that would result from any given set of institutions must, of course, depend also on non-institutional features, such as the actual behavior of people and their social interactions. The third feature relates not to the subject matter of reasoning about justice, but to the voices that should count in this reasoning. In the social contract tradition, the views that must receive attention have to come from those who can be seen as parties to the social contract. Given the country by country and nation by nation structure of social contract, powerfully identified by Thomas Hobbes and pursued in mainstream contemporary political philosophy since then, the contractarian tradition tends to confine the discussion to members of a given polity, in particular the citizens of each country, taken separately, who are engaged in deciding on the ideal institutions and the corresponding values for that particular sovereign state. The need for impartiality in the treatment of different citizens within the country are accepted and celebrated, but there is no secure place in this formulation of deliberations of justice to go beyond the citizens of a particular state. If this can be called closed impartiality, as indeed I do call it in my book, where impartial consideration is confined to the citizens only of a given state, we can contrast this with Adam Smith's insistence in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, a book published in 1759, 250 years ago, of which there is a new edition, by the way, published by Penguin with a long introduction by myself. The Theory of Moral Sentiments and also in The Wealth of Nations, and in his Lectures of Jurisprudence, which was put together posthumously later on. In contrast with the contractarian tradition, there is Adam Smith's insistence on the necessity to pay attention to the views of people from far as well as near. This can be called open impartiality in contrast. Smith saw the impartial consideration, which he argued was essential for a grounded morality and for understanding the demands of justice, requires us to go beyond the boundaries of each state and beyond the narrow and possibly parochial perspectives of its membership. The contrast with the social contract tradition, however, is not confined only to Adam Smith. Indeed, a number of Enlightenment theorists, including, in addition to Smith, the Marquis de Condorcet in France and Mary Wollstonecraft, the English radical thinker, and often remembered by the fact that she was the mother of the author of Frankenstein, and also had celebration in because of marriage to Shelley, but a great thinker in her own right. And later Karl Marx and John Stuart Mill, among others, took a variety of approaches that can be contrasted with the social contract tradition developed by Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, and in our time, most famously, by our leading political philosopher, namely John Rawls. These non-contractarian theories are widely different from each other, but they share a common interest in making comparisons between different ways in which people's lives may go, jointly influenced by the working of institutions, by people's actual behavior, their social interactions, and other factors that significantly impact on what actually happens in the world, how our lives go, and what freedoms and capabilities we respectively enjoy. As was mentioned earlier, it is the first of these two traditions, that of a transcendental search for ideal institutions through some version or other of the social contract, on which today's mainstream political philosophy largely draws in its exploration of the theory of justice.